Hi, my name's Ellie. Thanks for joining me today. Well, anyone who has seen my recent video with the title Goodbye will understand this episode today, because this is a moment in that video where I'm displaying something I'm going to be talking about today. It's that issue of having a moral dilemma. I had to make a choice. Do I do what feels right, which may not have the same material reward, or do I do what doesn't feel right, but I do know that I'm going to love some of the other consequences associated with that, which are kind of a little bit less spiritual. Let's just put it that way. Well, as I said, I made my decision, and those who remained with me remained with me, and those who didn't, they're on their own journey. Today, let's talk about this topic of the moral dilemma. But I'm going to respond to a recent viewer request and look at it in the context of the ancient Indian stories, because this is an area of wisdom that I haven't delved too deeply into, but I intend to. So let's do that today. So long before Christianity and Judaism and Islam or any of the Abrahamic offshoots, the Indian subcontinent was home to a vast and ancient spiritual tradition. The earliest teachings of this tradition were preserved in Sanskrit. That is dated somewhere from around about 1500 BC onwards. And it was passed down at first through oral storytelling. And then it was engraved on palm leaves and other types of materials, and ultimately ended up on stone tablets and rock faces, so that we were able to find it and examine it today. Today we know of this tradition as Hinduism. And Hinduism centers around a number of different writings, but there are two epic writings that really are part of the heart of Hinduism. And they're called the Mahābhārata and the Rāmāyaṇa. They differ from one another in very subtle ways. The Mahābhārata is the longest epic poem we've ever known of in the world. Just to give you an indication of scale, word for word, it's about 3 times longer than the Bible. But if you were to only pull out the poetry, because the Bible has a lot of poetry in it as well, if you were to pull out the poetry, then the Mahābhārata is around 15 times longer than the Bible. It's an ancient Indian story about family rivalry and moral dilemmas and spiritual truths. At its heart is a great long epic war between two different aspects of the same royal family. We don't know whether the Mahābhārata is based on a true story or whether it's simply allegory, because it is very old. But it is all about war, and we know that. And what makes it so profound is that war is tragic, and it has lots of aspects of reality that are difficult to face. But what makes it so profound is that not only does it talk about the issues of conflict and tragedy around war, it also goes into a lot of descriptive detail and seems to have a very complex degree of deep understanding about the human condition. It talks about all kinds of aspects of what it means to be a person, and the dilemmas and the tragedies and the spiritual awakening that arises throughout a person's journey in life. It is, in fact, a mirror of life, a kind of a timeless conversation about how to live with courage and integrity, even when the path ahead looks as though it's an impossible one to be able to pursue. The Rāmāyaṇa is also an epic story, but this is about a single individual. This story. It's about a character in Hinduism called Rama. It's all about the love he has for his wife and his epic quest to rescue her when she falls into the clutches of a demon king. In a similar way, it's also a mirror of life. It teaches us countless lessons about how to love, how to honor, and how to light up life's darkest moments with spiritual awakening. If I was to compare these two epics to each other, the Rāmāyaṇa is a shining lamp, for example, so it illuminates with light, and it shows us the ideal way of how to live. But the Mahābhārata is actually a mirror that reflects life as it really is, with all of its beauty and all of its flaws and all of its moral complexity. That's how I would kind of compare them to each other. So today's story is going to come from the Mahābhārata, and it's a story about a warrior prince called Arjuna and his crisis of confidence, where he felt he couldn't go on. He didn't know where to go. He was just paralyzed, not knowing which decision to make. Arjuna was a warrior prince. He was brave and he was skilled and he was highly admired. He was born into a royal family and his entire life was all about being trained to fight for justice. But on the day of the Great War, which is the basis for the Mahābhārata epic, Arjuna faced something that none of his training could have prepared him for. He stood there ready to fight, and as he looked across the field, he saw something that just destroyed him psychologically. The enemy that he saw in front of him across that field was filled with people that he loved, cousins and uncles and teachers and even childhood friends. They were the people who'd shaped him as a person, as a man. They'd guided him, they'd shared laughter together, and they were his friends, they were his family. This had been a war about power and the acquisition of land. But to Arjuna, suddenly it became a very personal, heartbreaking moment. His hands were shaking and his chest got tight and he'd kind of dropped his bow. He really couldn't continue in that moment. Now there are 3 different principles of Hinduism that come into effect in this epic tale. The first one is Brahma, and that represents the creator. We then have Vishnu, who is the preserver, and we have Shiva, who is the destroyer. Vishnu, the protector, was represented in this battle by the character Krishna, who is similar to Jesus' character in the ancient Hindu tradition. And he was at Arjuna's side during this battle. He was actually considered in this tale to be the incarnation of one of those deities, Vishnu. In battle, he was also Arjuna's charioteer who was driving forward the horses. And he was Arjuna's spiritual guide in this moment as well. So when Arjuna's hands began to shake and his chest was tightening and he had dropped his bow and he was feeling lost, he didn't know how to proceed, he said to Krishna, his charioteer and his spiritual guide, he just said the words, "I cannot do this. I cannot fight." And at this moment, well, the Hindus call this Arjuna's dilemma, where he's faced with an impossibility. He is a warrior. That's his purpose, is to be a warrior. But he's refusing to enter into battle because he's a human who is torn between his duty and his emotion, between something like justice and his compassion. There was this justice associated with the war. The war was just in Arjuna's understanding, but also his compassion for his family and his love for them was also just as real. And so he was paralyzed. It was this spot between paralysis and being able to act. So people become paralyzed today with lots of decisions that they have to make. And, you know, my example of how I had this period of time where I really wasn't sure where to go either. I knew what felt right spiritually, but I also had to think of practicality. And it took me a while. I kind of sat on the fence and I wasn't really sure, and I tried this and I tried that. Well, Arjuna was paralyzed in exactly the same way because a decision has to be made. And that paralysis and that decision making manifests in lots of different thought processes. For example, is it right to hurt other people, even if I believe that I'm doing the right thing? What if my actions do cause pain to someone that I care about? Or how do I choose between what I feel and what I'm expected to do? I think that was very similar to mine, to my kind of feeling like I'm expected to do something, but I feel so different. And Arjuna has that kind of sentiment in the story as well. And what if my duty that I'm supposed to perform breaks my heart in the end? What if Arjuna had to kill his own cousin over a matter of duty? There are other examples, though, of people who've had to face these really hard decisions on a much broader scale than anyone like a content creator like me would have to do. One of those people is Abraham Lincoln. During the American Civil War, Lincoln chose to continue to fight in order to preserve the Union and to end slavery. That was his duty, was to do that. And he did it knowing that he would be sending thousands of young men, including the friends and the sons of his political allies, into deadly battles, and that some of those people would die. But his sense of duty was that he needed to continue to fight. Even though there would be a sacrifice of life, it was also there to preserve life as well. See how hard that dilemma is. But then there's also a person who I want to talk about as well as another example of a very different kind of dilemma. And this is the kind of person who feels that they have to change as a person, even if they're afraid of what they might lose in the process of that change. And a person that I think really embodies this in a very profound way is a young Pakistani girl who was 15 at the time. Her name was Malala Yousafzai. She's known as simply Malala. And she spoke out about the need to educate girls in Pakistan. This was in direct conflict with her community's conservative beliefs, and she knew that she would be alienated and that she would end up experiencing backlash as a result of this. But she felt that she had to speak anyway. Malala was the young girl who was actually shot in the head by Taliban gunmen for speaking out, and she ultimately did survive. She had to have a number of surgeries, and there was a lengthy period of rehabilitation. But then ultimately Malala went on to become the youngest ever Nobel Peace Prize winner. And her story is now one of the most recognized modern examples of courage in the face of violence and intimidation. So you'll see that Abraham Lincoln and Malala both had different scenarios. With Abraham Lincoln, his decision was that either way there was going to be the sacrifice of people. He either had to stand up for justice and risk losing even the friends of his allies, even the sons of his allies, or he would cower back and then others within his country would suffer. And he ultimately chose his sense of duty to enter into conflict. Malala Yousafzai had a different dilemma. Her dilemma was one in which if she went out on a limb, that limb might break and she could fall, and that she would be alienated, and that she would be victimized, and that she would be targeted. And that's exactly what happened. But she knew it was going to happen. She didn't know how it was going to happen, but she knew it would in one way or another. But she still had to speak, because to her, speaking was the right thing to do. This is what it means to have the Arjuna's dilemma. That duty feels equal to the contrasting emotion that you might feel. And so they're equally powerful, and they do. They stop you in your tracks where you don't know what to do. You don't know what's right. You don't know what the right decision is. Everything seems as though it has overwhelming consequences. And for Arjuna, in our tale, this was a moment of his breakdown, the breakdown that we have when our conscience collides with our sense of calling. Everybody experiences this during their lifetime. And it's that moment when your soul stops and it says, I can't do this. I just can't do it. I can't make this decision. It'll either be something small or it might be something big or something in between, but it's a fundamental moment of your life, regardless of how big or small it is, because the direction that you choose, because ultimately you'll have to get out of that deadlock, and the direction that you choose is going to define you as a person. It's there for a reason. And it's because this is one of the stepping stones in our path towards our ascension. So what happens next in Arjuna's story? Okay, well, in Hinduism, Krishna is similar, like I said, to the Jesus character. Most people, when they're called upon to give advice, they might say something like, toughen up, this is your duty, just do it, something like that. But Krishna didn't do that. Instead, he met Arjuna inside this space in his mind, inside the dilemma. He goes inside those feelings and he helps him to reframe his perception of what's going on in his mind so that he can then make the decision that is right for him. He does this in a number of ways. Firstly, he reminds Arjuna that he's more than just his body or the role that he's expected to perform. He is an eternal soul. It makes all the difference. And the people that he fears losing, including those that may be killed in battle, are also eternal souls. Their bodies may perish, his body may perish, but the soul will continue forever, infinitely. And in the modern equivalent, what we could take from this is that when we're paralyzed by a decision, it's important for us to remember that we are more than the current fear that we face or the current role that we have to perform or even the success or the failure of the moment. There's more than this moment that exists for us because we are eternal. The second thing that Krishna does when he's responding to Arjuna is he reminds Arjuna that his role as a warrior is not about personal revenge or personal gain or anything like that. It's about upholding justice and what is right. So that doesn't mean he necessarily goes into battle, and it doesn't mean that he necessarily retreats from battle. His role is about upholding justice and doing what's right. So the real question is, what's right? What is your calling? What is your responsibility to truth, even if it's uncomfortable? This is unique to everyone, so you can't tell someone what's right or what's wrong for them. This is something that we need to find inside ourselves. So think about, I was trying to find an example of how to illustrate this, and I decided to land on the Vietnam War as an example. So during the Vietnam War, there were a large number of people who dodged the draft for a variety of different reasons. Some of the people were simply afraid, or maybe they were selfish, or maybe they were lazy. This is Krishna talking about personal gain, right? But other people dodged the draft because they found that regardless of army duty, their inner truth prevented them from participating in war. That was their sense of protecting what's right. They did not believe in war. And of course, in this instance, that means that their truth was peace. It's that moment of finding the inner light of truth inside you. So in Hinduism, it's called Dharma, which is called our calling. And that's our responsibility to truth. It's not about personal gain. It's not about saving your life. It's not about avoiding discomfort. It's not about just wanting to, do whatever you want without having to be responsible for anything. It's about following that fundamental truth that defines you as a person. And so that takes us to the third stage of Krishna's advice to Arjuna. And that was that once you have identified your Dharma, once you've identified that truth and that calling within you, then it's time to detach yourself from the outcome, from the consequences of your decision. It doesn't matter what the outcome is. The thing that matters is the truth. So one of Krishna's famous teachings goes like this. It says, you have the right to your actions, but not to the fruits of your actions. This can be sort of understood in a number of different ways. So for example, free speech is an example of that. You have the right to say whatever you like, but you do not have the right to determine what happens to you as a result of what you've said. And in another way, if you give of yourself generously to others without expecting anything in return, then karma kicks in, which is of a higher power, and you will get eventually, in one way or another, the reward of whatever it was that you gave of yourself. It might be immediate, it might be later on in life, it might be in the next life. But ultimately it will come. And one of the reasons why is because you have given of yourself generously without expecting anything in return. We have the right and the power to act in accordance with truth. What happens as a result is out of our control. And so at this stage in Krishna's advice, he says to Arjuna, that is the way it is, accept it. So for me, in my example, as a content creator, I ultimately decided to stay true to myself on this channel. It might succeed, it might fail. It really is up to you guys. And that's completely out of my control. But I'm going to do what's right for me because that's my truth. That's the truth that I feel is right. That's my calling. And if you act with full commitment to your calling, but you don't chain your peace of mind as to whether you're going to win or you're going to lose, then that's when we know that we're in Dharma. We're in our calling. Because when you are in Dharma, it's not about the result. It's about the state of being. That means you have the universe with you. Okay, so the fourth message that Krishna gave to Arjuna was to see the bigger picture. Arjuna's role as a warrior and in the war, well, it was part of something much bigger. It was part of a much bigger cosmic order. Our modern lesson that we can take from that is that every struggle we face or every dilemma we face is part of something much bigger unfolding that we may not understand, that we may not be able to see. We may never know what the bigger thing was. But knowing that it exists makes it easier to decide what happens next. The fifth bit of advice that Krishna gave Arjuna, and this was his final message to Arjuna, was he urged him to rise above his ego and his fear and his attachments to anything, including his attachments to the people across the field, that he needed to act from the deepest, clearest part of what was within him, without any kind of fear of loss or failure, and to think about, in light of all of the other messages that Krishna had given him, what the action that feels as though it's most aligned to his truth, what that one is. When you stop thinking about the consequences, when you realize that you're only a small part of something much bigger, and once you're in that Dharma of understanding what your purpose is and what your calling is and what your truth is, then the decision that you feel you must make will be much clearer. And this is the light that the Gnostics say will guide you to your ascension. It's your higher self that's speaking to you once you get to this point. It's the message of who you really are and the light of enlightenment that shows you the way forward. And it's also the universal truth that guides our divine perfection and closeness to our Creator. If you are removing your fear from the circumstances and taking away elements of ego where you feel as though this is about you, and instead be mindful of the fact that you can't control the outcome, all you can do is define yourself as a person with the decision that you make. And let the universe deal with the rest of it. You become aligned with the universe. Krishna's advice for Arjuna wasn't about war and whether to fight or not. It was about transcending this sense of paralysis that he'd been feeling and turning it into a purposeful action. Even when Arjuna's heart was very heavy at the prospect of either fighting against his own family or denying his sense of duty, the overarching message was to trust that when you act out of truth, you're never actually alone, because when you act out of truth, you have the power of the whole universe at your back and by your side. Imagine how powerful you are when you have the universe on your side. And I actually get a chill as I'm saying that. So while I'm talking to you, I want you to think about the things that you're putting off right now. For example, are you avoiding a difficult conversation with someone? Is there a decision that you've been postponing because you don't want to hurt somebody or you don't want to make them angry? Are you holding back some kind of a dream for yourself or a reboot of your life because you're afraid that you might fail if you try? What this story from the Mahābhārata says is that surrender is not the same as giving up. When you give up on something, giving up is an act which derives from mental exhaustion. But surrender is different. Surrender is an act which derives from mental clarity. And when you surrender, that's when you decide to let go of your need to control things around you. It's when we choose to align ourselves from the deep truth inside us and trust that everything else will unfold exactly as it should. Not overcomplicating it with worry or calculated analysis of, what might benefit you the best and things like that. It's just trusting that the universe will be with us if we choose the universal truth within us. Because of course it will be. If we choose that universal truth, then we are in line with the universe. When you think of it so simply, it just tells us how simple it is to follow the universal truth and to find it inside us. Have you ever noticed that when you surrender to something, everything just seems to ultimately unfold as it was meant to? When you look back and you think about things that have happened in the past, and at the time they were so difficult and you struggled against them, but they happened anyway. And then you look back years later and you go, gosh, thank goodness. Because if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't have experienced this, whatever it is that you're grateful for in your life. That's just the way the universe works. And so we know already, if we've been watching this channel for any moment of time, we know that the universe always wins. The universe always wins. And so we're either with it or we're not. And this is one of the morals of the story, of this story of Arjuna. We're either with the universe by finding that truth inside us, or we're struggling against it. And the truth inside us is the key to aligning with that universal truth, moving with it rather than against it. So if you were thinking about something in your own life that you've been putting off lately because you're paralyzed by the decisions and the options that you have available to you, then ask yourself this question. If I wasn't afraid of the result, what would I do next? And then let me know what it says in the comments. When you hear that answer, the answer to your question rising inside you, that's your inner truth. Just take one small step towards it and you are aligning one step closer to the universe. Oh, and before I go, I've got to tell you the end of Arjuna's story. What decision did he make? What did he decide to do? Well, let me read this out because it's quite succinctly stated in the following passage. In the end, Arjuna rose. He took up his bow and he stepped into the battle, not for glory and not for revenge, but because he understood that doing what is right transcends fear. He met the chaos of war with a calm, clear mind, protected now by Krishna's universal truth. Welcome to the new world. This is Ellie Dreams Down Under. I love knowing you're here, and I'll see you in my dreams.